But
Okay, go for it.
to still work towards what I wanted to say, like that fusion of Hermes and Dionysus, and I'm just gonna repeat like the basis of it, like the how Dionysus discovers the cosmic Sophia all around in the whole of nature, while Hermes conceives it from the whole of one. So it's literally the pendulum is Hermes is the one whole, and then Dionysus is the all whole, like the fullness. While Hermes is the thinness, let's say. You feel me?
Yes.
It's the ethereal and the physical in a way. But
Mm. How did you,
anyway,
I'd love to ask, how did you arrive at that conclusion? Because listening to you speak, within the metaphysics of what you're saying, is the ability to understand what certain people believe to be gods and other people esoterically or potentially internally interpret psychosymbolic pathways that restructure interpretation at a very, very deep level, right? Because what you're doing is you're using metaphorical systems and concepts to describe these links between absolute abstraction, aka heaven, that which the eye cannot behold, and yet the eye of the eye through the heart is always perceiving. You're taking the most abstract and you're bridging that to the material world in a way that's very non-ordinary. Usually, when people describe, Greek mythology and things of this nature, it's usually the moral dramas or the stories of what Hercules is doing or what was going on here in these abstract sort of tellings. But it's very rare that someone is able to actually perceive the inner symbols that were used throughout all the ancient cultures, including Egypt, to tell deeper stories within those layers. So what you're describing here, that's not something, at least for me, I've never read. I've read quite a lot of Jung. I've read Joseph Campbell. I've studied ancient civilizations, but I've never heard such an articulation of Dionysus as the all whole and below, and Hermes as the celestial or the ethereal. So what did you go through, or what did you learn in order to piece those two connections like that? That's extraordinary.
before I respond to the question, thank you. First, thanks for expressing it like that and also
Mm,
paraphrasing in your terminology, because
mm,
it also illuminates more understanding of my own process. Like for me,
mm,
this feels like destiny. It's not been a
mm,
choice, but I've
mm,
grown to learn, especially since slightly like I'm not gonna say that. I'm gonna put it June 2019. I received a book, and that started to open up. I got it from a family member, an uncle, but that opened up these mythologies for me. Back before, I wasn't interested in it because every teacher, every professor, everyone who was talking about mythology to me felt like they're just living in this abstraction and
mm,
with that are completely dissociated from the core. And
mhm.
I've written essays on academia going into that. Like we should reframe it with an inwardness. We should
Mm.
re-inner it.
Yeah, yeah.
And that is het inner. Or in German,
There's that
yeah,
was so extraordinary. There's a point that I feel like I just need to jump in and share with you real quick before I lose it, because I feel like it relates as a simple example, but to your point. I remember when I was working in education, I was teaching, and I was once observing a class. It was some year 6 students, and so they must have been 11 or 12 or something like this. And the class was about South American sort of Aztec related mythologies. And I dropped in on this class and I was watching these videos and looking, and I was so inspired. I was feeling so energized by this experience, obviously perceiving the living archetypal structures that then activate within the psyche. And then I remember the first teacher made some comment, just sort of in jest, about, so come on, do you think that really happened? Or something of this nature. And I remember thinking, wow, you don't think it happened. I perceive it's always happening because the psyche is always present. And so mythology is a language whereby the human story is told again and again in an unchanging way with those fundamental archetypes, as we talked about with regards to Jungian metaphysics. And it seems that there's a divide between people that intuitively can detect that, and then other people that still think mythologies are meant to be historically evaluated or critically traced through some sort of data-based way, right? Archetypal stories are the fundamental structures of the human experience told through universal images, right? Such as the Christ myth of the universal monarch who triumphs over every possible form of human anguish to emerge victorious in that, or many of these other great universal structure myths, right? Myths, realities, right? What is myth? What is reality? How real does something need to be considered real? But then what is real? Our senses or stories that were here before we were even born physically, right? Because from that point of view, we will only endure one lifetime. But stories about what happened in Mexico 3,000 years ago when people think they saw a dragon, people are still reading about that on Wikipedia, for example, right? Will they be reading about us in 3,000 years saying, wow, I wonder what they were doing? It's less likely, right? And that's why we have these great heroic kind of stories that we all look up to and are so inspired by. And I think just to kind of summarize, I've been rambling now, but just to kind of summarize that, I think I don't know whether it's a given that everyone is able to perceive that way, but I think that when you begin to start to perceive that way, it means there's an opening from the heart, a willingness to know life more from abstract representations of beauty to matter-based representations of beauty, because there's a love for the true and therefore a love of the eternal, if that makes sense. And the way that that is then reflected in matter, just to make this very practical, is with that fashion brand or with that new project or something of that nature, whereby that experience of beauty is then harmonized and channeled through you, you know, just a random commentary there that just kind of popped up in my mind there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, let me feel what I want to respond. Yeah, there's actually two things I really want to express. The first is like my destiny, my personality, willed it to be that I'm an introvert intuitive by default, let's say. Hence, for me, the internal world has always been way more encompassing than the outer world. So from there, I've had a portal inwards to grow ever more rich inner world.
Wow.
And since 4 years, that's been
Wow.
clicking. So, like for me, that Hermes Dionysus element came to like shock. Like when I use Instagram, I always use like an electric shock sign because that's how it feels to me. Like I'm shocked by lightning. There's an insight, and from that is a poem. I wrote a poem on Hermes and Dionysus.
Yes.
I had to say Hermes twice. But so that's what it's been for me. And in parallel to that journey, and that's the second thing I want to say, I could also elaborate on how that's really unfolded in the past 16 years. because that's been the guiding light also of my studies in philosophy and
Yes.
psychology, like more towards the collective, because I felt you hinted at it, and I love you for doing it because I think it's a wise layer to see. What I perceive as this archetypal layer, like a dome above us, that is sort of like our potential, and that structures the personal. So it's archetypal in the sense that it's transpersonal, but still it's the patterns of humanity, and they are like the when you etch in marble, it becomes like a deeper, deeper clove, you know. And that's the same with these archetypal layers, and they determine where people go, unless they decide from, by God's grace, I would say, that they free themselves from those cloves and carve their own path. But as you know, that seeking is quite a path. Um, but fate also has it, and especially history has it, that this archetypal layer has been demonized. And Christianity has put their main focus on the good God, like the summum bonum. There's no greater good than God, and Earth, humanity, is the under moonly. Dutch is better, but like we are the imperfection under the moon.
Right.
Yeah, and so no, I lost it. But I can easily recapture it because yes, so Christianity has separated the two, and that separation has dissolved and demonized the actual truth in the middle, which is pagan. The pagan part in which we have a sub divinity. It's not the one and living God. In that sense, we're still monotheists because there's one whole. The whole itself of the paradox is undivided, but the paradox itself already is polarized, the father and the mother. And from there bridges all polarity. But that one whole is pristine. And that's in me the Hermes. Because studying philosophy, Hegel was one of my biggest interests, and he sought to bridge history with the development of spirit. So how the material history reflects the evolution of spirit. And that's all hermetic, because every time I seek the whole of paradox, Andrew Tate is both a man with a very vicious shadow side, and he reveals something of tremendous value. And if we can't hold both, we'll collapse in the polarity. And my work has been for at least 14 years, 15 years, to hold the paradox. And that's where it comes from for me.
Wow. That was incredible.
I could have gone on, but I was like, no,
No, that was honestly one of the most brilliant descriptions of metaphysical perception I think that I've ever heard. It's the ability to comprehend the most subtle of language, and the most subtle of language flows. You know, even as you were describing the nature of universal substructures, I was visualizing them almost like energy channels in a way, as you mentioned, structuring the personal. And I started to wonder, as you questioned, what if those pathways of energy could start carving out their own patterns?
Yeah.
And I think if you look at the development of civilization, you almost get a feeling for that activity and how it's working, how myths inform moral and political stories that are inside of the dream field, for example, how these energies are mobilized and how new psychopathologies are almost invented because new neuroses have also been invented because of some imbalance as a result of the inability, as you mentioned, to hold polarity. So if polarity is almost the central investigation of metaphysics, because it is really to perceive into the most subtle of phenomenological analysis, then metaphysics is the art of deconstructing timeless language patterns between psyche individual and psyche collective, if you could say that, and then maybe universal energy flows. How are people mobilized? And you can say, yeah,
like
and
material
yeah,
reflection of that psyche. Like that's
absolutely.
the primary polarity.
Yes. Yeah. And so where people then begin, as you mentioned, meeting themselves in the respective icons represent almost the psycho-spiritual development of the civilization that you're observing, so to speak, right? This to me is one of the fascinating things about how different cultures can have such different moral approaches to things. Like if you go to Japan, for example, the sense of morality about how one participates within the social enterprise within or as a collective is so different to the Western world, right? There's almost a sense of being a deeply flawed person individually if you're not in some ways preserving or forwarding, the collective in some sense. So the moral approaches always determine. And so you could say behind every flourishing civilization, particularly with regards to the arts, could you say that polarity balancing was more harmonized, such as the ability to have jester gods and gods of ecstasy and gods of divine pleasure and gods of, well, even Dionysus, right, being associated with kind of divine ecstasy or inspiration, right? Could you almost make the assumption that because they perceived that that was something that is the perfect prototype and pathway for potential activation, that it therefore reflected in great flourishing, great thought. And now, for example, as you mentioned with Andrew Tate, having something of tremendous value, but people's inability to hold, then seeing that, and it reflects what they're starting to lose within themselves potentially, which is not this shadow component here, but that thing of tremendous value because of the emphasis on the personality rather than the metaphysic or the message, so to speak, right? And so this is really, to me, why this is so fascinating is it's because when we talk about things like the meaning crisis, either at a personal or collective level, this kind of philosophical thought allows us to start asking the right questions. Which story are we in right now? What are the stories around us right now? What stories around us in the collective noosphere, as one said, what stories around us have we internalized? What stories should we be internalizing? What stories are oppositional, as you mentioned, out of balance in terms of polarity? How do we harmonize that within our own selves so that we can essentially activate full potential or full potency or full presence, so that truth, goodness, and beauty are lived virtues rather than abstractions? Because for the Greeks, for example, it really was the case. It wasn't something that you spoke about. It wasn't something that there was great conversations about. Everything reflected and beheld beauty. So everything was ecstasy. Do we live
Yeah.
in an ecstatic world right now? You look at modern cities, does anything about them scream universal pleasure and ecstasy? Or does it say ordered world whereby human potential is channeled? Because a civilization is the desire to harmonize collective intent towards a shared purpose, right? It's the mobilizing of all individuals together towards a destiny. But we no longer live in societies where you can just go for a walk to just behold everything and discuss with such freedom. They often say a philosopher can't be hungry, right? One needs to have certain base levels of human, needs met, for example, to be able to reach those abstractions, And so for truth, beauty, and goodness to really become lived through us, we need to be living in that shock that you described there so beautifully. It just emerges from you, just that shock that emerges, right? That to me is the presence and potency, as we described earlier, of truth, goodness, and beauty wanting to emerge through you as a result of entheos, so to speak.
Mm. Yeah, that's what it's
a profound conversation.
First time I felt that electricity was in the words of Kierkegaard. And he said, the individual is a living whole of the paradox between infinite and finite, eternal and temporal, individual and mankind. So he draws these three basic paradoxes, and then the individual is the living whole of that. And I read those words by Kierkegaard. This is from Sickness Unto the Dead. Yeah, it's a horrible title. Like, it's not, especially for our age, a bit a heavy feeling. Maybe, I don't know. I would actually. But, it's gorgeous. And what he does in that is he bridges the polarity in mankind and then in the individual. And that's what struck me back then when I first read that book. And this is 2010, the summer of 2010. And yeah, so from there, that striking then seeks to, as you said, echo in all realms of life. But that's quite a process, because if you know what is true, the lie hurts even more, you know? It's a cruciating process, because everything is contrasted and highlighted, and it's been terrible. And if some people look at it and say, oh, wow, what a heavy or intense life you've had. But to me, and yeah, it's reflected in my poetry, it's really felt like I know I'm this diamond in a very strong, dark mountain, but I know my core is too radiant. Like, I will outlive this mountain. Literally, that's what that diamond told me, because the dark at some point, also through the dark and depth of Kierkegaard, wanted me to not be alive anymore. And it's always a very, very heavy subject to people, but to me, it's now just like drinking coffee. But like, the not wanting to be oneself is literally what Kierkegaard said is the main problem of modernity. We don't want to be ourselves. But if I immediately go to the archetypal layeredness of that, wanting to be oneself, so then there's wanting to be oneself, is not wanting to be oneself. So you're not okay with who you are right now, but you're also not okay with who you could be, with your potential. You're also not okay with the fact that you're not okay with it. So that's that's the anxiety driving mankind. And that also creates the mass man, like the big mass of people where no one is an individual anymore, because everyone is subdued to something they are not themselves. The herd, let's say. And people want that because their emptiness hooks into that. But who dares standing in the fire of his own emptiness? Like, in this way, I was raised by people like Kierkegaard. And from that has come eventually that mythological layer. And now I see how we, like, it's always been there in my life, but or at least 15 years, I mean, how metaphor is necessary to bridge the gap, as you just said, between that metaphysics and the physics. Metaphor bridges that gap. Somehow it touches us, it opens us, it expands us internally, so that the material world is no longer this subject-object polarity, this duality. There's a collapse of spirit and matter that, yeah, are whole. Like, there's no more duality. Yeah, and it deepens and it lifts us up. And I think that is exactly because of what I sort of proved. I think I proved in my master thesis, that it is true. We have metaphysics, and from the metaphysics emanates the physics. Like there's this vertical relationships, and at the same time, the material world is the body of God. So that's the stretch of the polarity of infinite finite.
Mm.
I stand here like this. I like this, but I also notice like leaving the silence. Yeah, I do want to continue. That vertical stretch also opens us, mankind, because we stand there as the eye, but for us it becomes horizontal too. It becomes a left and a right, woman and a male. It becomes anthropomorphically polarized, let's say. And but that's only possible because that's the father and that's the mother. We cannot escape anthropomorphism. That's another big one in my book. It's used often as an argument in academia, like just anthropomorphism. And then they go read their very. No, I'm not going to bash them right now. But yes, but I'd say we can't escape that because it's our inherent nature. It's aligned with like we come from the father and the mother, and then we are born to the father and the mother. We have to leave. We have to abandon them, and the painful process of leaving home, and then we leave home because then we can find our own home. And in the process, we've refined the material world in its mirroring the spiritual. Purpose of evolution.
Yeah. Yeah, that was an extraordinary articulation. The one thing that
really, or do you say that to flattering? I have to sense you doubt something. Please test me.
no. That was really extra. I'm savoring it. I'm just appreciating how extraordinary that was.
Okay.
What jumped out to me there was you mentioned I was just purely listening and you know agreeing and feeling the resonance with everything you were saying. What really jumped out to me was an opportunity to draw a parallel in a sense when you mentioned that we come from the father and the mother, and therefore from that moment of conception we enter into a world of polarity in a way. And so suddenly within myself I quickly thought of the first mythological structure that reflects that concept expressed in a different way, and that's where the Christ myth comes from, because he comes through a mother but by the will of an absolute father. And so this is a really interesting conception here, because within certain Eastern philosophies, there's a notion that the unknowable God, that which has no name, cannot be perceived, has no qualities or functions, but is the eternal, has a conception of being the Father eternal, absolute. But then the relative God is when we move from the masculine to the feminine, is when the energy of the eternal unknown becomes known through the relative. And then we have this transfer from the ultimate potency, i.e. Shiva, into Parvati or Shakti, when that begins to materialize into the matter or mother. So we've got the absolute eternal father and the relative knowable mother that structures the potency of our relationship to the divine in a sense. And now with the Christ myth, or the mythological story structure within that, is the idea that there is a man who has no earthly father, and yet he has been conceived from a woman. So if there isn't an earthly transmission of an earthly father, there's the heavenly transmission of a heavenly Father, and that's the absolute eternal will, right? Let your will in heaven be done as it is on earth. Take the absolute and make it the relative, so to speak, right? And yet, from that emerges a being that defies the basic polarity structure. Everyone comes through the earth by a father and a mother. He came into being by a woman. That there's no father which can be perceived by the eye, because the father and the son are one, as opposed to the mother and the father being two in opposition, and therefore male and female being in opposition. And so there's the emergence of the Father and the Son are one. The will in heaven is the will on earth immediately, because heaven and earth are bridged. And so the kingdom of heaven, in some ways, is, you mentioned how the metaphysical and the physical become one is with metaphor. So the kingdom, we can behold the kingdom, an opulent civilization, but heaven we cannot behold. So what happens when the opulent and the eternal becomes something you can behold, not from the eye, but from the heart? You can then perceive the kingdom of heaven. So he spoke in these great metaphors that actually, you made a great point there with regards to neurolinguistics, very relevant in the current age with AI and so on. What are the neurolinguistic structures at the metaphorical level that bridge absolute and relative into comprehension? Because the ability to comprehend abstraction is oftentimes what separates civilizational social structures. We see this, for example, with Egypt, with a specific writing class, right? Who alone can fathom writing structures based on ancient symbolic structures and pictorial language, but then many other aspects of civilization not being able to do that. So what we're able to comprehend as metaphor, as physical, represents, you could maybe say, accelerated neurolinguistic structures of intelligence that allow you to perceive absolute within relative. And the great artists that are able to do that, I would say, for example, is like the poet William Blake, who often speaks to these conceptions of beholding the infinite, the perennial, the enduring, the endearing, the true in every moment. You know, that you read one of these poems and you're immersed. You read some of the poems of, Jalaluddin Rumi, for example, the Sufi poets. You read these poems and you're immersed because divine presence, you said it beautifully earlier. You said the world is the body of God. And so that is such a high abstraction that if incorrectly comprehended, could be interpreted so differently. It requires an ability to understand the highest, most perfect absolute is within my perception. From knowing that, I therefore live in divine love. It's being able to comprehend how intimate the divine experience is to everything around us, how close compassion is to everything around us, how easy it is to love others, how easy it is to behold beauty. You know, so you said the world is a body of God. No, go on. Would you like to continue?
Yeah, like there's many things, but what really came up is,
feel the flow.
It's also a choice, because
Yes.
acting from love, yes, but I'm holding the polarity. I was just about to post something about myth of Cupid, and who's actually Eros, and how my life is also a destined expression of Eros with Cupid arrows, and how Cupid arrows have both gold and lead versions. One paints and one opens everything into love. And I have that choice. For example, so this is new to me, like the non-dual side of what you said, presence and being in love with everyone, everything, was for me that feminine side of truth. And the masculine side is the potency, as you said. So, like, I
Well
love
said.
Yeah, I
Mm,
love your highlighting that polarity because that's
mhm,
it for me too. And then the
mm,
potency is imprinting the will upon matter, while the presence is being receptive to the fullness. And for me, a lot of practice has been walking around with zero specific object, just merging. And at a certain point, I got so many synchronicities. I knew it was the path. I started to dive deeper into it. And it's true. Like for me, nature
mm.
feels like archetypally talking to me constantly. It's a and when I say that, my heart is like, it's, yeah. And I also appreciate you highlighting that it can be dangerous because I'm also discovering that it makes me a bit unpredictable to people, or at least people can't read me because I'm partly human, partly dancing archetypally.
Wow.
And I'm laughing because I'm now at a point in my life where I'm so okay with myself that it just feels like a film to me. It really does.
Wow. That is that is really I'm almost in a complete meditative samadhi right now. I can barely find words because I'm so absorbed in the truth and the resonance of that. It's that to me really describes the aspect of solitude involved when you're connecting with life through archetypal relationships as opposed to causal or transactional relationships.
Mhm. Those
I
two are
some
big triggers. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. I sometimes feel that people's inability to read me as well, and I seem to have lost the ability to even receive sometimes what I hear from people. It's like it's just filtered out because it's not at that resonant field of the structures that I relate to or relate through with life. And I think you said, when you have a strongly developed inner world and you have these portals into presence, you start to relate to life archetypally rather than more materially. That seems to be at the crux of, to me, what I simply visualize like something just spinning really quickly and just generating a sun inside of it and just a universe. That cycle that's taking place there. Um, I really wonder if that ability is what we call sentience. That ability as the human being to comprehend yourself not in spatial or temporal dimensions of matter or measurable or time bound, but in stories that live on beyond you. The ability to stand and simply perceive a sunrise or a sunset. The ability to be walking through a certain road and you see something in the material world that completely mirrors something that's been within your, can I say, perceptive field internally. These moments where you're seeing your experience of consciousness outside of yourself. Um, is that a representation of what it means to be Is that the difference between a human and a flower? You know, some of the mystics of the East often say that man can blossom and become a rose or fall lower than that of a pig. And so complete unconsciousness, alienation from presence through an exteriorization of self into matter, the pig, or the rose, perfect emanation of beauty as it manifests. Is man the struggle, the inner dichotomy? And is that why all of the mythological structures often have wars or a conquest or a triumph or a victory or the light or something like that? Because we are trying, as you mentioned earlier, this was a profound point that I wanted to allude to. We're all subdued in a sense. So just to something, right? To some social structure. And so is the ability, as you described, to be in this world, but also dance archetypally. Have you, in other words, uploaded your consciousness into a meta layer, synchronized with a physical layer, such that you're knowing yourself beyond the material explanations of reality? You're interpreting life in the form of what the story was. In other words, you're discussing with Sophia. You are inside of the dialogos, could it perhaps be said, the divine dialogue. You're reaching for the hand of God, so to speak.
Yes.
You're reaching to bridge, right?
And it's not a belief, it's like a knowing. But I want to highlight the shadow part that also comes with this. So I felt this restlessness in the back of my conscience, like this, something's off. And I was walking through Amsterdam on one of the many walks, and then out of nothing, I see this building, and it says, how can I just translate it? Was a Dutch word, but it says something like the cash collectors for an unpaid bill. You know, like the incasso. Is that a word you use?
I know what you're describing, yeah.
Yes. So
Yeah,
I
go on.
saw that building, and that too spoke to me with the same magnitude. So that too was a signal for me, and I felt like, okay, so somewhere in my life is an unpaid bill, and that will surface at some point. But now I was more proactive, and I could look for it. Turned out my that's funny that I cannot reach for the day-to-day words. Anyway, the agreement I have with the train, the railway thing, um, it was unpaid for some reason, so that had stacked up, you know. And I've moved houses, and that has shifted some letters that I did not receive. And I found out all of that during these explorations, and that's the point I tried to make. Like, it's not just love and light, but Sophia is dialoguing. It's also these day-to-day things. It's truly her wisdom. She wills to reveal to you what's happening. Another great way of looking at this is through the lens of love. We fall in love with someone, we outsource our unconscious parts, and then we fall into each other, and then it feels whole, and then it ruptures, and then the holes emerge again. And then we can work with them so we can heal it from within. And the same thing is alive. It's a law. It's a law that's happening, that those things attract for that reason. They fit. They are hooked. Like, all this natural language is at the same time metaphorically charged by a religious archetype. That's just what I've been seeing, and kept being affirmed and affirmed and affirmed. Even such a day-to-day thing as a fucking bill in 2024. You know, that's how up-to-date Sophia is. And it's no coincidence to me. They call the first robot AI Sophia. Because to me, the whole transhumanist agenda, like the technocratic, totalitarian vibes they often echo in society, are based in this misunderstanding. They really want to recreate Sophia, that the pleroma of intelligence, the pleroma of gnosis, Sophia and Theos, the pleroma, the fulfilledness of wisdom. Like Abraham Hicks saying, ask and it is given, is based on that saying. It's Sophia has already conceived it. It's already in the fullness of her. And we are the children of Sophia and Theos through which it's born. And they are constantly helping us from above and from nature upwards to get us there. Yes. Funny, right? Because I opened that channel and it's just like that. And I feel safe with you because I don't feel very safe with this flow with many people.
Mm.
I'll be very honest about that.
Yeah, yeah. I really felt everything you were saying there. Yeah. That was that was a great commentary on, I think, the current age. I think the way that the structure might be playing out at the moment is that exteriorization, right? That need to recreate, as you mentioned, which to some degree subdues the aspects within of spirit or meaning or truth or logoic quality of the saying, man does not live by bread, but by every word which proceeds from the mouth of God. Not by bread, not by the material, but by the declaration of the eternal through the way that Sophia wills herself to be, for that process to emerge. I think you've reflected to some degree to me what might be a strange question here. But I noticed that I've been living that way for so long that I contemplate the perennial in an unpaid bill. And I would almost say that now is the first time that I'm enjoying the oscillation that takes place within that. I'm enjoying the way the divine flows into the earthly and the earthly flows into the divine to create renewed systems of inspiration for myself. There are times of almost absurdity in the nature of the material world. And then there are times when one can behold such beauty in the nature of the material world. I was in a supermarket earlier. I just finished a lovely brunch and I was walking through a supermarket. I was passing by this woman and I just said, "Oh, you have a beautiful smile, by the way." And she was so struck by that, started blushing. "Oh my goodness, thank you so much." I said, "No worries." I just walked straight on. I just had to say that just in a moment of being, And there was a part of me that acknowledged the absurdity of that. There was really no impetus to do that. I didn't necessarily need to do that. And yet it was an instant moment of thinking, inspiration is I can bring it into reality. Inspiration is I can bring it into reality. Inspiration is I can just will it to be in moments. I can just strike in moments. You can just feel when you're afraid or contracting and just do the opposite and just will, something to be. And so in every day, you mentioned the pendulum. I think for me is the absurdity of the material realm and the way that the heavenly realm's archetypes can flood it sometimes. But now I wonder, this is the question now. I wonder whether this is a new question. There's a part of me, honestly, from my heart right now that feels like I might be asking something that's never even been asked before. But is this now what we call meta philosophy? Is this what we now call questions about the nature of how to be in relation to questioning about everything which is. It's fundamentally oscillating. So am I moving through today in a divine dance with archetypes? Or am I moving with today on the existence of only matter? What is the relationship between matter and the divine? How do they oscillate? What is the nature of those polarities? And how do we harmonize that within our perceptions so that someone greeting you and just saying, hello, how are you doing today, is the opportunity to not only respond to the very literal truth of how you're doing today, but also to behold the absolute divinity of that experience, of consciousness knowing consciousness through one coherent field of relativity. One coherent field of relativity. So enough activity as it relates to the relativity of the experience, self and other dichotomy, but an equal amount of dilution whereby there is no self and other. What did Jesus say? Love thy neighbor as thyself. That's a non-dual premise. Love thy neighbor as thyself, because thy neighbor is thyself, to collapse the subject-object. So this divine dance that you're discussing here is a divine discussion or dance that you're discussing here is fascinating, because what does it mean now, metaphorically, metaphysically, to oscillate between these two polarities? Is that the process whereby you actually kind of are realm jumping, if that makes sense, because your destiny informed by your thoughts and your energy and your capacity to perceive unity and polarity is comprehended archetypally. Therefore, you're moving through time in a different way. You're not remembering dates and numbers and so on. You're remembering structures about your, what's the term? Apotheosis, if you will. The expulsion of yourself into the divine presence, right?
Can I hook onto that?
Yes, please do.
Or were you still working towards the point?
No, go for it. I was just flowing. You can go for it.
Yeah, so I wanted to tie two elements together because, as you said like 10, 20 minutes ago, this is no longer instrumental or the other one that you mentioned, instrumental relationships. And did you say intrinsic, or which one did you add?
I'm not sure now, but go on. I'm sure
Yeah,
we'll
well, at
get
least
there. Yeah.
the common lens of relationships is that it's an exchange, that it's instrumental. Oftentimes people see something and think, I'll take it, or I do
Yes.
something because then I'll get that. And I've been very sharp and on myself the past 4 years and asking lots of strong, a couple, but together very strong field of sharpness towards myself, of clarifying who I actually am in all of this. Where am I actually coming from? Apart from whatever everyone else says, like where am I coming from? And every time I got back to the fact that I live archetypally, because when someone tells me it's an instrumental relationship, or they want something from me, or they want me in their life to enhance something in their life, or to fill a gap, or like all of those instrumental things, for me, end up in me being very sharp with people in some way or another. But at the same time, if there's an intrinsic valuation that's more on soul level, then I notice I respond with love. And now I want to take to the archetypal step, how it's woven through the day to day. Like as you said, with the smile of the woman, I have the same on a day to day basis this happens to me. The example that happened yesterday, but I could also describe the one of the day before or the day before that. But yesterday, what happened was I arrived at Amsterdam Central Station and I walked out and I see this man who's like 1 meter 60-ish, who clearly has an impairment to his body and to his psychic capacity, while traveling alone with a suitcase that was pretty heavy for him. He had like a limp. All short, a very vulnerable man. And I saw him, immediately felt his vulnerability at that moment. And I saw his helplessness, especially. Then I also felt he had a need. So I opened my system. I opened up to him, and he asks me, could you help me? Because I need to go to platform 4. He was a German, never been in Amsterdam, and he couldn't find it. And he also couldn't walk there because he could not even carry the suitcase. I have no idea how he got there. I think by taxi or something. And I just said, I just didn't even think. Then that archetypal layer came in. It lifts me up. I have no thoughts, no specific preference for feelings, whatever. I take the suitcase, bring him all the way up to the platform. Took me like half an hour to walk with that man because he was strongly impaired. And then at the end of it, I put him in the train, but then I quickly had to go out because the doors were closing and I didn't need to take the train. So, and that was it. He didn't even thank me because he had no time. Like, and I have no problem with him not thanking me. Why? Because all of this is driven by archetypal intent. It's like I'm a vessel and I'm available. Another instance that happened was like a week ago. There was a Muslim woman who was on a scooter and a van had driven into her. So she'd fallen hard on the ground and had a massive wound on her knee and bleeding here in her cloth. I saw that on my race cycle. Same thing happened. No thoughts, nothing. I just felt like lifted up into becoming a vessel, cycled towards her, put my bike to protect her from other traffic, and stayed with her for a full hour. Energetically held her from the shock of the energetic system. I contained that in full presence, looked her in the eye, kept communicating, you're safe, you're safe. So that could dissolve. When I felt she felt safety, I asked, could you, who is your safe person you could call? And once that, all of that was rounded up, I just took up my bike and went for lunch. And nothing sticks. I tell it now because it's relevant. But I've not had the desire to brag about this. This is just my life. And and that's what I've somehow told the universe by going so deep into me, to Sophia as my anima, and not different women, not like the personal, but the impersonal Holy Mother. That's who I'm really available for. So if women go into dynamics with me to like try to get romantic with me, does not work. It always ends at me being in Sophia. And also I have to add from a more vulnerable layer, because I'm also confused in this, because a part of me wants to become a father and seeks a very personal mother too. So I send mixed Cupido arrows at times too, just to own that. Just to own that. But still, this keeps recurring. You become impersonal and ungraspable through that archetypal. But at the same time, I've been called an angel many times the past months by a woman like the Muslima. Those situations, like, and I notice now why my safety, because I'm afraid when I share these great stories, I'll come across as arrogant, whereas bragging. and I know with you it lands in an understanding frame, and then I can be that confident. I know. So no,
That's extraordinary. Yeah, no, I'm so glad that we have that space, you know, because I really love receiving, because these moments of extraordinary presence and connection where the archetypal moves through you, to me, are one of the ways that we really behold how alive the dialogue really is, in a sense.
yeah.
How true it really is, how embodied it really is. That destiny is alive. Destiny does not have to be dead. Spirit does not have had to depart. You know, grace is living. And I can revere these moments as well, whereby the relationship between the absolute and the relative makes one almost divided between two structures. I can relate very deeply to the yearning to be a father, but at a similar time, a kind of block that until I've somehow manifest something for my first love, that I cannot embark on any other expression of will. You know, there's that loyalty, there's the eternal loyalty that if you broke that, the most true version of you might become exiled from you, because it's those very first inclination towards the true, towards destiny, towards a relationship with that knowable, you know, force, so to speak. I can honestly say that I don't think I've ever heard another person actually describe that. And yet it feels so familiar to me. So I'm unsure whether I should be moved with a kind of interdimensional reverence, or whether I should try to describe this or try to put it in a box, try to make sense of it. But I can honestly say that likewise for me myself, there have been certain situations of encountering people in certain situations where you okay, I would love to share a story, and I have to say this is going to be a big step for me. I've only ever shared this with my mother, actually. But to feel fortunate that we've created the space between us, I'd like to share this one with you. It's quite similar to the lady that you encountered. There was a day where during the day I was standing on a field simply looking at the sun. And I was just humming different songs, but I was often just simply saying, behold, behold this, behold this, behold. And it felt like maybe 2 hours went by. And all of a sudden I started humming like a sound. I will send out my armies to find you. I will send out my armies to find you. I will send out my armies to find you. And I just sort of hummed that quite merrily until I got back to my apartment. And then I was watching some Netflix, laying in bed, just relaxing. I was just watching some Netflix. And then I'm chatting with a friend, and all of a sudden it's like randomly at 9:30 p.m. And I suddenly start chanting that again. I'll send out my armies to come find you. I'll send out my armies to come find you. I'll send out my armies to come find you. And I suddenly say to my friend, okay, I'm feeling kind of hungry. I'm going to go up the road. There's a sandwich place. I'm just going to go grab a sandwich. And as I start walking, it's quite late now. And again, that chant's playing within my unconscious. I'll send out my armies to come and find you. I'll send out my armies to come and find you. And I see this family, this homeless family on the street, just standing there. And I didn't feel anything, but it was an immediate acknowledgement of this reality. And I made mental notes. I'm going to buy them the biggest meal that I can. I'm going to get the warmest, biggest meal that I can find, even if it's just at the sandwich spot. But I'm going to give them as much as I possibly can. But I'm not going to say anything now. I don't want to get their hopes up or something, whatever happens. But I'm just going to go do it. And then as I'm walking back, I'll greet them. went to the restaurant, forgot about my sandwich, bought the stuff, walking back, see them on the road. I go straight to them. I say, hey guys, I got you some dinner. How's everything going? And we just started having this conversation together in the evening. And it's extremely windy and very rainy and very cold. It was during the winter. And I immediately knew to take off my jacket, quite a new one at that, and to give that to the mother, and to take off my hoodie, quite a new one at that, and to give that to the son. And then I said, would you guys mind if I just ate with you? I would just love to be here with you. And I just wanted to be in the truth of that moment. I just wanted to be in the, my unconscious even clocking, what are you doing right now? But I just thought, I'm just here right now. I just want to be here. I just want to be in the aliveness of this. Tune out the narratives of however this could be interpreted anyway. Just be in the now of it. And we had a beautiful little dinner. I said, you know what, guys? It's going to rain tonight. I would love to invite you to my home. I live just down the road over there. You can come with me if you like. We can finish our meal there. They said, okay. So this mother and two children, son and a daughter, start walking with me. I say, so what's going on, in your life? And they said that they ran away from an abusive father. From Johannesburg, they walked to Cape Town. From Johannesburg, they walked to Cape Town. Johannesburg to Cape Town, that's about a 16-hour drive.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
So they walked and hitchhiked all the way to Cape Town. I was absolutely astounded. I say, when did you arrive in Cape Town? They said the 17th of August. And that's my birthday. 17th of August, and that's my birthday. And all of a sudden, I felt, what have I been sent to do in this moment that is not for me, but something's about to manifest. Something's about to happen here. And so I brought them into my home, and it just so happens that 2 months prior, my mum was here, and she just bought me some things for the house, And so in a cupboard, I had like toothbrushes and toothpaste and socks and all this random stuff that she bought, just to make sure I have a supply of these things. And now all of a sudden, now I see these two kids, and now I've got these two supplies. And I say, hey guys, here's this, take this. Hey guys, I have 2 toothbrushes. Do you want to go brush your teeth in the bathroom real quick? And then I had like 2 pairs of socks and stuff like that. And I gave that to the mother, and I said, I know this church, down by this particular road. I would definitely recommend you go there. You can get some resources and stuff like that. And we're just speaking. And as the evening goes, the fear that was present in this woman, having been on this journey that she has been on, was reassured of the deepest benevolence. As you mentioned with that woman that you had encountered as well, the fear was dissolved out of the space, and it was just contained in a way where something truly transcendent is accomplished. It's a moment where the experience of another person's inability to comprehend that grace and love could coexist with this experience, you're there to reassure that. That to me is a divine experience. That to me is when you're in a dark situation or you're in an unpredictable situation, and the aspect of you that recognizes that nothing truly ever terrible, that truly breaks the soul can happen. And that's the presence of the eternal that lives within us. That's the demiurge. In a particular form of interpretation, the explosion of selfhood into logoic capacity or archetypal intention harmonized with the world, it comes forth through you in the most pure and beautiful ways. So anyways, with regards to this family, just to summarize what goes on, but we have a great conversation. I feel very privileged to give them these gifts. I take them to a homeless shelter. I get them some supplies. And what ends up happening is they are entering into the shelter, but they don't ask me to go in with them because they say it's very dangerous and you might get mugged or robbed or something of this nature. But they said, we're just going to go into our place. can you just stand there and watch us? Because if the other people see that you're there, they won't do anything. And so I watched them in that moment. It was one of the scariest moments of my life, and yet one of the most raw and cold and realist moments of my life. Because at any given moment, the urge towards the divine would have had me run in full power and take a brick to the back of my head if it means to fulfill archetypal intent, to bring forth benevolence and beauty and be eternalized, just like Achilles or Alexander or Socrates, right? Into that single moment, or Plato, right? Can be so strong in me sometimes that I would just do that. And at the end, at any given moment, there was the fear of, Shégan, like, do you know what's going on right now? This is kind of insane, dude. It's like 11:30 p.m. on a Wednesday. Go home right now. What are you doing? You already gave them some things. And in that moment, it was contained. And I remember thinking to literally as I was walking down a road at one point with them, I remember thinking to myself, what would David do? Like, really, what would David do? For some reason, my heart just went to David, King David. What would David do? What would David do? I was just, for me, David has always been just might and divine strength and just power. You know, what would David do? What would David do? And the craziest thing is that the name of the son, the mother had a son and a daughter. The name of the son was Emmanuel. And the meaning of Emmanuel, of course, is that God has given us victory, or God has brought us triumph. And so the boy's name was Emmanuel. And in that moment, later on in the evening, while everything was fine eventually, later on in the evening, I was reading about the word Emmanuel and some of the phrases and terms associated with it, such as the house of truth shall not fall, or the house of David shall not fall. And that evening was one of the most real evenings of my life. And immediately the next day I grieved because I thought to myself, I will never tell that story.
Why?
It's gone. It's dead. Because I would never feel safe enough, as you mentioned, to introduce or expose that to someone else, because of how these moments of being infused with entheos are interpreted by people who cannot see the kingdom of heaven, metaphorically speaking. Okay. So it's a great pleasure to be able to share that with you and to feel safe enough to do that with you as well right now, because it goes to show that so many of us are living out the most extraordinary destinies every single day. Sometimes I wish there was an Instagram page of people sharing stories like this, and you listen to a reel and you say, wow, look at how the divine manifested in that person right there. Because then we would all feel so much more empowered to live like superheroes, if that makes sense, right? Here's something that happened, and here's how we experience this, because we're all capable of being that, living that, knowing that, experiencing that. You know, it's so real, it's so alive. But oftentimes, you know, it's a relationship. But then we also say, I mean, there's also another component here. They do say beautiful things don't ask for attention. I wonder whether some of the beauty is that these moments sometimes take place behind the scenes. You know, let me take a sudden stoic approach just to be a little bit creative here. But they say that you can judge the quality of a man's character by what he does when no one's watching. So there's also a virtuous component that I like here. The real test of a man's character is what's happening when there's no cameras, there's no nothing. It's the aliveness of the moment. And that's where I find, especially the divine masculine, oftentimes people don't necessarily describe that, because that's how the divine masculine emanates, with an eternal certitude and will that can override even the fear of death and the relative, because the eternal endures. So the divine masculine's sometimes presence within the synergy of expression in polarity is often to remind or to deliver the message of the eternal, right? Being, and when we look at the Christ mythos, this is why it's so extraordinary, because not only is he ultimate virtue and self-sacrifice, but within each of the 12 disciples, we get to see sub-archetypes. So, for example, with John, you get to see the disciple that is so immersed in divine love of his rabbi, of his teacher, of his Holy One, that he only will speak of him in terms of great archetypal language. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But then the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst men. He beheld his glory so intimately that he describes him in that way. But then when you transition to Matthew, for example, and you read Matthew's gospel, all of a sudden it's the guy who is so captivated by the wisdom of the man and the absolute precision of this barely educated young rabbi who is dropping wisdom bombs everywhere he goes through these profound parables and stories. And he just wants to make sure he's recorded everything so that everything's there, because it will need some time. You know, that's the feeling that I get from Matthew. It's like these parables he told were so eternal, just record and be data intensive about them. And then you go, for example, to Simon Peter, and all of a sudden you get this leader figure who is so captivated by this divine presence that he wants to organize and orchestrate the intent of this figure. He almost is becoming a sort of general, if you will, but he always experiences a clash between his loyalty to his master and his loyalty to the world. And so in these different moments, he wishes to pursue truth, but then he also feels the pressure of worldly obligations, having a wife. And so he reflects a lot of modern seekers, for example, where he's trying to, you know, his rabbi at any given moment might say, go and do this. And at any given moment, he's got a wife and a home and a business. And so in that dichotomy, we see the struggle towards the experience of truth whilst being subdued. So we have all these archetypal relationships within those personalities, and then we have that fundamental structure of self-sacrifice. Just to relate it all the way back to the start there, so that divine masculine mythos often plays out within the structures of our lives. And for me, it's in moments, in beautiful stories, the likes that you described, and the one that I'm describing now, and the ones that I've heard from many people that give me a lot of hope and inspiration, because it says that there are people that are just operating on an entirely different spectrum of consciousness in terms of their intention to bring forth timeless experiences here, drawing on timeless inspirations such as spiritual traditions, divine art, divine inspiration, great artistry, great wisdom, great teachers, great masters, and so on. That to me is really one of the core stories of our time, in a sense.
Beautiful. Yeah, as per usual, you say beautiful things. Shortly, on what you said about the apostles and the archetypes, I love them. A new friend of mine, and actually multiple, but one specifically sent me an article highlighting those 12 and also looking from there towards the zodiac, and then these multiple polarities, but through the zodiac it also becomes personal, so that also has to leave space for, as I think what you pointed out, that Christ as self-sacrificial archetype transcends even the personal, so he contained all of the polarities of the apostles, but brought them to there. This is an intuitive speculation I always have when she talks about these subjects. But I wanted to, yes, more importantly, bring in more my vulnerable side with this. I find it so fascinating that what you mirror back to me is it inspires you. And actually, some friends have told me that before, multiple, I should say. But in me, like apart from outside world, in me has been this doubt if I should tell these stories. Part of me wants nothing else than to constantly do that. Like today, I love to cook for myself. And today I made like I've been cooking my whole life, so I dare say I'm very good at it. And I made like a basic meal, a pasta with garlic cheese sauce. That's like 15-minute thing, but it's so flavorful that from there you can easily extend. Add a steak with some garlic butter on it, and add some mushrooms, for example. Just saying, like you can extend it from there, and that's what I always try to do. Take whole ingredients and build new wholenesses from that. Um, but also then comes my inner judgment, what which does come
Oh.
from childhood. I know where it's coming from, but when I
Mm,
share these fullnesses, you probably
mm,
also see in me, there's also a tendency in me to do shrink a bit again, like to doubt,
mm.
like, oh, what's just come out? Like, what's going to be the effect of that? And that's been because
Right. I hear you.
dropping,
Yeah.
yeah, dropping those flows, and you must recognize this, but dropping those flows
Um,
when feel it's coming from a knowing. It's no longer narrative, whatever. It's a knowing. It touches so much. I've broken hearts of professors because of their infantile ways of understanding philosophy. It's true. I crack it open. I told a teacher, a professor in Buddhism, who's a very high authority still, I asked him about Buddhist nothingness, and he came with like this historical answer. Yes, in the third century, you have Nagarjuna with the middle way, and I was like, yeah, I don't mean in the past. I mean in your life now. Where does that live? Where is that?
mm,
And he could not respond. Not. But what he did start doing from that moment onwards was treat me like a peasant, and he was the professor, and he was this top above me. And if you do those things to me, if you box me into your frame, my Solaris literally turns it on, and then there's some space still for reason. But if you keep downgrading or keep framing untruth onto me, this will burn everything in its way. So I told him the only thing he knows about Buddhist nothingness is the nothingness of his own teaching. And and in the end, he had to do my master thesis, and I graduated cum laude, so with an 8 average on everything. And he was like, "Oh fuck, you're not a student."
that's hilarious. Yeah.
Either way, Nora always recommends me to, yeah, be more of this and allow it
Mm,
and back myself in it and
mm,
own the responsibility, own the consequences as well. I'm really
mm,
grateful for her as a friend, and I'm great that she's also such a dear friend to you. Um,
mm,
but
mm.
yeah, to tie it all back too, because I also feel I have to round it up not too long from now.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Just to comment and then we can close on this actually,
There's
but
still
just on what
space.
you said, I think
There's still space, so take all space.
yeah. Um I think what you described there is really represents the distance between deep immersion in truth, such that any attempt or system to behold truth naturally unfolds and reveals itself to you because you're living in truth. When you're living in truth, whether it concerns the truth of the nature of the mind or the truth of the nature of phenomenological perceptions, or the truth of sensorial perceptions, or the truth, say, of suffering, but even juxtaposing that with the truth, say, of the nature of God in beauty. When your immersion in truth is so great, any subsystem that exists to channel truth outwards naturally reveals itself in a kind of fluidity that exists.
Yeah.
And I feel that it's always funny, these rebellious moments. I love that you mentioned Solaris, because these moments when you see people who claim to speak some of the truest words to ever be written or communicated in the history of human consciousness, and they treat it as if it's an intellectual exercise, as opposed to miraculous divine revelation. And so you ask a person, where does Christ consciousness live in your life? I'm not asking you to quote a scripture. I'm not asking you to quote a story. I'm not asking you to describe this, that, the other thing. How have you immersed yourself in the expression of that divine truth within your life experience? And that's where all of a sudden you start to realize people have only been tasting the shell of the fruit. They have not drunk the inner flesh of that fruit. You know, I wasn't going to say this, but I'll share it in the interest of complimenting your story. I had a Muslim friend of mine the other day share a Quranic verse with me. And I said, look, at this point in my life, I've read all the scriptures. I've read all the texts. I don't need to read another sentence. And I immediately just responded in the text, and I just said, and what does this represent? What does this hold? And how have you known this recently? In some Islamic end-time prophecies, it is said a time will come when scripture or the wisdom traditions will be to man like nothing other than ink on a page. But it will have no truth over him. It will just be something you read. And so I even thought at that moment, when you think about some of the greatest spiritual masters of our time and how oftentimes how against they were trying to box Sophia, Siddhartha Gautama, Vedic society, all of these rituals, all of these rites, all of these processes, all of this elaboration, he says, guys, if you don't comprehend how to perceive, what good is what you do to these stones? Jesus comes along to the Abrahamic world of pagan worshippers and stone, people praising idols and so on, many of the Old Testament prophets. Guys, do you believe the divine essence dwells in that stone right there? No, it's the eternal. It's not in the stone. You don't need to go and offer money to a stone. Rather, offer your love to the eternal. Don't worship the stone. So you look at all of these extraordinary. I've actually got a book on my shelf somewhere called Torchbearers of Spiritualism. And the contents includes Pythagoras, Moses, Confucius, Muhammad, Jesus, Apollo, Volupsa, Elijah, Socrates, and many other extraordinary hero spirits who have always lived in some way to disseminate, if you will, divine rays of connecting to the absolute. These are our spiritual heroes, you know? And so for those of us who have lived intimately to that, even if you're not affiliated with a religion or a scripture or anything like that, but you live in truth, you're in reverence to truth. And so sometimes when we find people that have institutionalized truth, it reminds me of Jesus when he looks at the doves in the marketplace in cages. And of course, the cages are kind of I interpret them as the mental models and the dove as divine inspiration. So he says, why have you turned my father's house into a marketplace?
Mm,
Why
yeah.
have you turned my absolute eternal experience into a bazaar of transactions by putting the dove of the solar logos within the cage of civilizational structure? And he turns over everything with his whip and he gets really mad, right? And he casts the money around. How dare you do this in my father's house, right? This profound statement.
Yeah.
So it often contrasts what, some swamis in India say. The difference between a divine personage and a theologian is something that we must honor, because a divine personage is connected with Sophia, that when that person passes away, that's going to be a Sister Teresa. That's going to be a Nelson Mandela. That's going to be a Martin Luther King. That's going to be a this, that, and the other, right? Something more is coming out of them that a lot of people might never see, right? So it's this understanding that the immersion of truth that produces great mystics, great saints, great writers, great artists, William Blake and such, right? That experience often comes from deep immersion of truth, whereas a theologian is one. Now, this could be a polarity I have yet to reconcile within me, but a theologian is one whom has created an AI robot named Sophia. That is to say, turned the most free-flowing eternal essences into something to be mechanically studied and put into boxes. And though itself is an extraordinary science and art, is not the same as what it means to drink from the cup of life, the living water, right? Like when Jesus asks the woman if he can have some water, and she refuses him. And he says, if you knew who I was, I could give water that you would drink once and you would never need to drink again. I will give you water that will never leave you thirsty. And
Yes.
that's the water of life. That's the cup of life. That's the eternal, right? So an extraordinary conversation, and I can only say that I see your doubt in myself as well. We can just round off on this point, but the doubt that you mentioned, I just wanted to address that. A few words
Yeah.
from my perspective there. I recognize and I see a lot of that in myself. I felt a lot of it, and what I've only learned, to be honest with you, this year is that inner world is so personal and so treasured. It wants to be so protected and so safe, at least this was my experience,
Mhm.
that translating that to the outer world when it's been the most personal of the personal has felt very difficult at times. How much do I bring out of
Yeah.
these experiences that are so true to me? How much do I do? Does anyone even think these ways? Does anyone even perceive these ways? And so one almost needs to, or one almost goes on a journey in reconciling that. For me, the answer that I came to myself was, I now have a duty to bring it out. I mean,
Mm.
everything you shared with me today, the amount of times I thought to myself, hey, we should call once a week, every week for the next 5 years, record every conversation and put it on YouTube, and it will become one of the greatest dialogical conversational series ever. There were so many points here that could have been its own podcast episode or, YouTube lecture or something like that, because I felt in that moment so resonant with these truths that we've expressed that it was like, wow, this is very real and very eternal. But the inability sometimes to do that, at least for me, has been, is that better reserved for an internal experience, or should
Yes.
that be made manifest in some sense? I am currently on that journey now where I have decided that there is no higher duty, honor, or purpose more motivating than that one. There
Mm.
couldn't be. I've tried so many different approaches to life, and nothing I've found has worked but allowing that to be manifest. fully looking at everything that ever wanted to hold that in, because we never know what we can inspire or create for ourselves or others. You know, we never know the absolute power of that. And I think when we're empowered and when we know that our gifts are treasured and needed, then it becomes even more inspiring, because all of a sudden you realize that there's always been a unique, powerful voice within you that will and needs to be expressed in order for the deepest aspect of your soul to be at peace as a messenger of truth, or
Gospel
at least a lover of truth, right? Yes.
This is the esoteric Christianity that's been, but I see time, and I super much, that's great English. I super much love your proposal. Have an episode 2. I press record. We're just going to post it.
Yeah, yeah.
And let's do that, because I agree.
Yeah.
Like, together we pull it out. And the way you formulate, there's moments where something touches and it lands and it deepens and feels like this, like that. There's two verticalities meeting, and then the infinity is flowing like that.
Yes, yes.
Yes. So we're going into episode 2, and then we'll dive into where we left it off right now.
Yes, yes. Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. This is really a dialogue, really in a great sense, you know? It's a dialogue.
Let's call it Dialogos or something, and we'll make a YouTube channel.
Yeah.
And let's do it.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds great. I'm very excited for that. Very excited for that. It feels so organic. That just feels so resonant for me, you know. This was an extra. I have to say, this might be one of my all-time favorite conversations. In terms of just absolute presence and resonance, you know, this was an extraordinary articulation of many truths and many layers of truth. So
likewise, genuinely, like I've been able to string things together. And in the same time, in your spaciousness, and that's that inner dimension where you can meet me there and you can hold me in me, because you are there for you. You have that space available for me, hence. So I noticed I was able to go, and I can now again fully go into that, because this energy wanted, like, it's triggered the most when Sophia is threatened. A dear friend of mine, not into conspiracies, but she didn't want the vaccine. But she was ostracized by family and friends for having an intuitive no, a full body intuitive no. And my solar plexus was triggered to living fuck. And then you say, trigger, it's yours. No, not every time. The solar plexus to me has a very specific meaning. And it's exactly the parable you described. It's the Holy Spirit, or Sophia, in the cage. That's my deepest pain. And also my solar is strongest in willing to even die in protecting that.
wow.
Yeah, like this. See what I now allow. And it's really like, and I should be fully autonomous and always be able to do that. And I can when it's really needed. But I want to grow into the familiarity with that. Yes.
Yeah.
So episode 2.
Yeah, episode 2. Let's do it. Awesome. All right, man. Great. Well, you take care then. We'll speak again soon, yeah?
Next weekish. Let's see you.
Yeah, sure. Text me anytime. Yeah, we could do the same time. I'll be quite flexible. You can let me know.
Yes, and always, if there's vulnerable, emotional, whatever layers, all is welcome.
Yes.
We're going through the exact same thing. So it's we both have it. If I have shame of this, probably you have it too. So let's just drop all those masks, like, and just have that open, you know?
Right.
I love you, man.
Wonderful. I love you too. Awesome. All right. Well, you take care then. And I'm going to go, I think I'm going to go actually now journal some of these extraordinary points here. I find that this opened a lot for me. This really opened a lot of connections as well that I didn't realize could be so vividly articulated between the intuitive, instinctual activity with life and understanding the nature of what drives it. You know, this is the first time I'm really encountering the way that that's happening. And I think I've learned a lot of new language structures tonight to be able to bridge the metaphysical. So I want to be able to go and anchor some of these points now, make sure I keep it fresh. Maybe I lock in some of the core concepts, and then I'll just marinate on it passively, you know, throughout the week and just kind of see how it evolves until next week. This was profoundly enlightening. Yeah.